Okay, welcome back. We're on the Dart Language Tour annotated docs talking about function parameters. You might also hear the word arguments. Functions are the things that in our code that do things, and there's logic inside of them. Sometimes in order to do stuff in a unique way or a different way depending on how they're used, you can pass in arguments at the time that they're called. And whenever they're defined, sort of the blueprint of the function, we call those arguments parameters. So parameters and arguments are kind of used interchangeably sometimes, so don't let that trip you up. Also, parameters can sometimes just be called params. Okay? So a function can have any number of required positional parameters. All right, let's see what that looks like. I think the main function, that's kind of a special case. So let's define our own function. Okay, and we will, you don't have to say its return type. It's best practice to do so, but let's just start with print something like so. And we will print hello world. Okay, the first thing to know about this is that print something is a function that I've defined, and it doesn't have any parameters here when I've defined it. When I've called the function, it didn't take any arguments to satisfy those parameters. That's the way to think about it. Instead, I kind of hard-coded in here this print statement, okay, and it printed out over here whenever I ran it. Let's do this thing. Let's set the type as void. So it's printing something. It's not actually returning a value. It's just doing something on the screen. Okay, verify that that still works. That's good. Okay, so we want to specify the return type, void, if it's not returning anything. Now let's make this dynamic. Instead of hard-coding hello world, let's say we'll have one parameter. The type is string, and we'll just call it value. I think a lot of times in programming, when you see functions defined in libraries, packages, and Flutter, you'll see the word value used a lot. It's like a generic term for the thing that's passed in. Okay, this is a positional parameter. It's in the first position. It's required. You can see it's throwing me this error here now that says, and this is, I haven't even compiled the program, it's just the analyzer, saying that one positional argument was expected but zero were found. If we look at these docs that it's pointing us to, not enough positional arguments. The analyzer produces this diagnostic when a method or function invocation has fewer positional arguments than the number of required positional parameters. Okay, so we're saying when we define the function, there are required positional parameters. When we called it, when it was invoked, the function invocation didn't have enough arguments. Okay, so again, parameters when we define it, arguments when we invoke or call the function. The following code produces this diagnostic because the function declares two required parameters, but only one is provided. Okay, there's the two it declares, here's the one it provided. You get the problem. To fix that, you pass two arguments to satisfy the two required positional parameters. That's it for that. Okay. So let's satisfy these parameters and pass in the value. Hello. Let's see, who are we saying hello to? Let's say Earth. Okay, there we go. So now we've passed in a required positional parameter. This thing did say it can have any number. I haven't tried it, but I assume you could have int x, int y, int z, and so forth and so on. And then you could do something like to string, and then add y to string, and then add z to string. Okay, now let's pass in some values, 1, 2, 3. All right, 4 required positional parameters. value x, y, and z. They're doing something inside of my function, and when I call it, I've satisfied the number and the types. Okay, a string and 3 integers. And if I run that, it should say something like hello earth 1, 2, 3. I just concatenated them together because that plus and to string is just string concatenation. It's not actual math. Change the type to the wrong type, and we get an error. Okay, so there's good type checking. I don't know that the types are required whenever you do positional parameters or even name parameters for that matter. I think you might be able to do something like this. Okay, so it ran again successfully. It's good to put it in here so when somebody's looking at your code, they know what kind of type to use whenever they're calling it. Okay, so leave those in. Okay, that is a quick introduction to required positional parameters, any number of them. Okay, now these can be followed by either named parameters or optional positional, but not both. And we get into named parameters here. They have this little note here, some APIs, notably Flutter widget constructors, use only named parameters, even for parameters that are mandatory. I don't know that these are always actual functions. Let me show you something here in the class. Because like what we've done is we just have a couple functions. Our main one kind of gets things going, and then we're calling the one we define up here with some parameters. There's actually no classes that we've declared here, but inside the classes section on the language tour, there's this thing called methods, and methods are really just functions that live inside of a class. Okay, they give that instance of a class behavior. So if you have a dog class and you say lowercase dog equals dog dot new dog, or dog with the parentheses, dog dot bark, like the bark method might be defined on for that class, for that instance. You can also have like constructors that kind of look like functions, and maybe they are. I'm not really sure how that works under the hood, but they can also take these parameters that refer to like properties inside the class, these variables, instance variables and whatnot. So yeah, don't confuse methods with functions. Functions, they can live on their own out just like in any file, and you can call them. Methods, I think typically have to be called from like the instance of a class or on the class itself, if it's like static. It has the static modifier. Okay, so let's go back to parameters where we were. Yeah, so like if you're familiar with Flutter, you might see something like a text widget that takes a string, right? And then it takes, like a style named parameter, and then you have text style, and you have a bunch of stuff in here. So this is like a positional parameter for the first one, followed by named parameters. You'll see that in Flutter, okay? Okay. Now, the thing to note about name parameters, unless you use a required keyword, I think they're optional, and positional parameters, if they're denoted in a certain way in square brackets, they're then optional. Okay, and we'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. But first we're going to do name parameters after we cover this last line. So you can use trailing commas when you pass arguments to a function or when you define function parameters. Oh, cool. Okay, so that means I can do, this. That should still work. Okay, yep, it works. So I added that comma there after Z, and even this one, I can add that comma there and run it, and it shouldn't affect anything. I don't know. I think you might be, I don't know how to maybe if I click format. Yeah, there we go. So what I did is, I was trying to see how to in Android Studio I can save a file and then it formats things. But here in Dartpad, you don't do that. So it looks like I have my function there, and because I added this comment, the comma after the final parameter, and click Format, it puts them all on new lines. Okay, so these are my parameters right here, and then here's my function body. Here's me calling the function name, and here are all the arguments to satisfy the parameters, because I had that trailing comma. Okay, so sometimes you want to do that for readability. Yeah, trailing commas are good. I'm glad they have that in Dart and Flutter. Okay, let's look at named parameters. It doesn't have its own section over here, so it's part of parameters. So let's keep going. Named parameters are optional unless they're specifically marked as required. Okay. Yeah. When calling a function, you can specify named parameters using param name and value. Okay. Yeah, so this is when you actually call the function. You pass in key value pairs separated by a colon, right? So there's the key value pair. You need a second one, put in a comma. When defining a function, use param1, param2 to specify named parameters. Okay, so we're putting in, whenever you define it, you have to use these curly braces. Okay, so let's look at a way to do that. Now remember earlier it said that any number of required positional parameters can be followed by named parameters or optional, but not both. So let's look at the named parameters that can be followed here. Okay, so we have our existing print something. Now let's add named parameters. Now let's try to just do it the wrong way. Okay, let's say foo bar comma. Okay, we don't know what foo is. Let's see what kind of error it gives us. Named parameters must be enclosed in curly braces. Try surrounding the named parameters in curly braces. Okay, so that it saw what we were trying to do, and it didn't allow it. Okay, which is great. All right, there we go. Now what kind of error did we get? Undefined named name bar. Okay, let's see. Whenever they do that, it's inside that. Do they have types? Okay. Ah, yes. Okay. Okay, I see what I have done. I was kind of putting it like this. I need to define the type and then the variable that's going to become a variable in the block. So let's try bool. And how do they do that again? They just separated it by a comma if they had more. Okay, but we just have one. All right, so if I just say bool bar, and let's say when I actually print it down here, I need to provide that. So I need to say, what am I providing to bar? It needs to be true or false. Let's just say that it's true. Now I haven't actually used it when I invoke my method, so I need to print it somehow. So let's just say bar toString. So if it's true, print the string true. If it's false, print the string false. Now everything looks good, except I think in the null safe environment that we're in with Dart nowadays, there's no guarantee that when somebody calls print something that they're going to pass a value. Okay, so we either need to say like, let's see, I don't like that trailing comma either. Expected to find that. It doesn't like that. But I don't think that was our problem. The implicit default value is null. Okay, so it's saying it's almost like writing that. Okay, and you can't do that. So let's say, can you do that? Let's say it's optional. Now it also expected to find this guy here. So there's something about that trailing comma it doesn't like. And I suspect, okay, it doesn't compile. So if I get rid of that, will it work? Okay, that works. Now when I reformat it, you see how it put all my parameters back on one line. However, I think I should still be able to do this. I should be able to have a comma down here. Okay, it still ran, and I can format this so I can see all my arguments on each on their own line. All right, so that's kind of interesting. It's unfortunate that it doesn't allow that. Maybe because, I don't know. That seems like a bug to me. Let me see what this says about the. You can use trailing commas when you pass arguments to a function, or when you define function parameters, as long as they're positional. Because if you follow it by a named parameter, looks like you can't do that. Okay, so maybe that's a bug. It looks like a bug. Okay, so named parameters are optional unless they're specifically marked as required. Okay, so we said this was optional, and whenever we called it, we passed in true. If, let me see, does this work? Okay, so because I said I'm not necessarily expecting this named parameter to have a true or false value, it still took that bar equals null as like a default value, okay, and turned it into a string. So that's where we got that null right there, because I didn't provide a value. Okay, if on the other hand we say you are now required, okay, so this is getting a bit hairy. Now we get a new error, and I think it's because we're using something's required. It might be because this optional bool, or it could be because I'm not providing the required argument. I see what it is. The named parameter bar is required, but there's no corresponding argument. Okay, it's required right here. There's no corresponding argument. Okay, well, let's fix that. There you go. Does it like it? Okay, so it works there. But if I take away this question mark on bool, it's now, in my mind, it's a different type. Instead of being of type bool, like it is now without a question mark. Earlier it was like bool question mark with like, I think you call that an optional, like optional bool or bool optional. Or maybe that's just how they did it in Swift for iOS. I forget off the top of my head. But let's see if both of these work. Okay, so one thing I'd like to clarify in the future is, what is the difference if you have a required name parameter? Does it make a difference to have that question mark on the type? We don't know. Okay. But if we get rid of this, we should get the same error. Yeah, no corresponding argument. Okay, so let's put that back. I like this. It's kind of weird to have the optional and required, I think. This might be the way to do it, so let's just hang on to that little bit of information. Let's keep going through the docs. So name parameters are optional unless they're specifically marked as required. Okay, so when you have this required keyword, it is required. Otherwise, it's optional. But as we saw, when it is optional, I think we had to have that thing there for it to work. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you're in null safe Dart, you might have to have that little question mark at the end of your type to make it null safe. Okay, when calling a function, you can specify named parameters using the param value, for example. Okay, just like that. We did that. We have bar true. Okay, there we go. And then when you define it, Yeah, so we did, so this is optional. So there, this version of Dart on the dart.dev documentation page is the null safe type Dart. So I'm not looking at an older version of Dart here. I don't know how to specify the version to look at different, versions of Dart documentation on the web. But just know this is 2.12 or later that it's referring to. Okay, so that looks just like ours. We have 1, they have 2, right? That's the only difference. If a parameter is optional but can't be null, provide a default value. Okay, so if it's optional, like this, but can't be null, provide a default value. So can I say true and leave this off? So whenever I say print something and call all the required positional parameters, this should default to true. And just because it's true over here to begin with, let's just say false. So the false satisfies the type, and it's a default value. Okay, so that's how you do that. Pretty cool. What if default values with required? Okay, that's a little weird, huh? What did we get here? Required named parameters can't have a default value. Okay, it's required, but you're going to have to provide it down here. Okay, so if you want to use a default value to kind of cover your rear end, in case you don't, actually pass it some arguments. Okay, there we go. So now everything's back good again. Okay. Although named parameters are a kind of optional parameter, you can annotate them with required. Okay, we've been doing that to indicate that the parameter is mandatory, that users must provide a value or an argument for the parameter. Okay, so we did that. Okay, so this is like an example, looks like from Flutter, where they have a scroll bar. This is, in my mind, these aren't really, when they show these examples, they're not really like functions, but maybe earlier, because we said in the functions area that you can also call an instance of a Dart class as if it were a function. Maybe that's what they're doing here. So for example, scroll bar with these parentheses is creating a new instance of that thing. Like in the past you could say new scroll bar. This is just const scroll bar, and it has 2 named parameters that we have to pass in. Okay, so this is like a const constructor. This isn't the actual invocation. So when you call this, you can either pass it a key, or it's optional, and then here you actually have to pass it a child. So a scroll bar has a mandatory child key value pair that you have to pass in. You just pass it a widget as the type of child that it is. Okay. Yeah. Let's keep going. I don't want to beat this to death. Okay, if someone tries to create a scroll bar without specifying the child argument, the analyzer reports an issue. So that's just like whenever we had required on ours. Like so. Remember, you can't have default values for required named parameters. Okay. If they don't specify the child argument because it's required. So for us, if someone doesn't specify the bar argument, the analyzer throws an error. Okay. So that's what that is. Okay, now let's look at optional positional parameters. So look at this say function they have here that returns a string. It takes in these parameters, a from, a message, and then look at these square brackets. It has optional string thing called a device. Okay. wrapping a set of function parameters in square brackets marks them as optional positional parameters. Okay, so let's say we try to add one here, string thing. Okay, you'll notice I immediately get this red underline on this comma, and it says the name parameter bar is required. There's no corresponding argument. Okay, I thought that was. Okay, here's the error I want to show you. It expected to find a closing parentheses, which is this guy, but instead I have my optional positional parameter here. Maybe it needs to go in front. Maybe it's just confusing it, right? Let's find out. Okay, well, there it is again. It expected to find it. The closing of the parameters, and then all of a sudden this bar, it doesn't even know what this is because it can't see that I wanted to also include a name parameter. Yeah, and the problem is you can't have both. You can have one or the other, but not both. So if you want to have name parameters, use name parameters. Otherwise, if you're going to use an optional parameter, you cannot use a named parameter. Even if, I think, okay, even if you don't have any required positional parameters, let's see if we can do something. Let's have optional parameter string thing. Let's just see if we can have optional parameters just like by themselves hanging out. Let's print thing. Okay, let's get rid of this. We'll just go back to our regular, dude, not cool. Positional parameters. Okay, there we go. I also want to do something. Yeah, it does the printing for me inside of itself. Okay, I'm not getting any analyzer warnings. And in fact, it looks like you can do this. You don't have to have any required positional parameters. You can have a purely optional one. But can I still have something like is awesome? You know, can I have that? It looks like I can't. Okay. So it doesn't matter if you have required parameters or not, required positional parameters. You still cannot combine or mix optional positional parameters with name parameters. It's not allowed in Dart. Okay, maybe that changes in the future, but for now, it doesn't like it. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of do something like so, and then I want to include some. Let's just make some of these optional. Okay, what I want to do is make Y and Z optional. All right, so now they're not required, but because they're optional, it says the parameter Y can't have a value of null because of its type. This was similar to what we saw with the name parameter, and we're effectively giving it a default value of null when we put it in here like so. Okay, so to fix that, let's see, yeah, it's the same error for Y and Z. Okay, so to fix that, we can either say it's optional in both cases. Okay, so we're allowing null to come in, null to string is just null. So now we're going to have hello earth 1 null null or something like that. No, it just says hello earth 1. Oh, yeah, duh, because I'm passing these values in, so it's fine. But if I comment those out, okay, now I'm passing in hello earth and the value 1, and these are optional, and I've excluded them, so it should print hello earth 1 null null. That's what I'm expecting, and there it is. Okay, so that is an optional positional parameter. Okay, I wonder if we can have a default value. We'll get down to it here in a little bit. Let's see. So like they're just showing how you can use an if statement inside your function, and if that optional thing is passed in, then you do something else as well. So, okay. All right, so we kind of did that on our own. The last bit before the end of this section is default parameter values. Yeah, so it looks like they're going back to the named, or yeah, the name parameters. What do I want to talk about here? Yeah, so you'll notice there's no concept of like a required keyword here, because by definition the square brackets make this optional. Okay, so don't make that mistake. If we wanted to provide default values here, we can do that. Okay, so now we have 23 and 42 as default values. We've invoked our method without providing values, so it should use those default values, and it does. Okay. When that's the case, again, like the name parameters, I don't know that we have to call our type with the optional little question mark. It looks like it works just fine without it. So again, this is something that I need to kind of figure out. Okay, so this is interesting. I've taken the types off of these optional positional parameters. And now I want to pass in something like 2.0. Will it accept in a double, or does it kind of expect it to be an integer based on how I've defined the parameter? I don't know. Okay, 1. So at 2.0 kind of became, let me say 2.99 and run that, see what that does. Okay, so it still interpreted it as a string and just plopped it in there. So probably what happens when you remove the type is it tries to infer from what's being done here, but again, I could probably print something again. Okay, let's say hello sky, give it the 1 again, but now instead of 2.99, let's say 2.99, like that. Okay, and then we'll still allow this thing to have a default value of 42 for Z. So I'm expecting to say hello sky 1, 2.99 like this as a string, followed by 42. Okay, and that's exactly what it did. Okay, so if you don't, even though I'm giving it a default value, somebody can do squirrely stuff. And probably what's going on here is it's probably setting the type to dynamic when you leave it off. Okay, so this is kind of doing the same thing. And I don't think we want to do this. So if you can, give it a type. If you can't, try to make sure people aren't going to use your program in the wrong way. Okay, because stuff like that can happen. Okay, where were we? Default parameter values. Yeah, I feel like I showed these earlier for the name parameters. Let's just read through it so I don't miss anything. Your function can use the equal sign to define default values for both named and positional parameters. Something I forgot to say earlier was that these named parameters, like in the Ruby world, they're called keyword arguments. Okay, they were introduced in Ruby 2.0, and you can see they look just like our name parameters. So this is a method in Ruby, and you define, so here's the name, it looks like a function name, right? And these are the parameters you passed in. They're named parameters in the sense that whenever you call it, you have to provide the name and the value. And And this is how they do defaults. So this is kind of how Dart used to do it with a colon. Dart now uses the equal sign. The colon's been deprecated, but that's called keyword arguments. They don't really, like I think in Ruby, maybe they just use the, no, they still use the word parameter. Okay, Ruby 9, you could use this thing called a hash parameter. Yeah, I think they call it keyword arguments because it's like a key value pair. Or the keyword, I don't know. Anyways, just know that they're called keyword arguments in Ruby, but named parameters in other programming languages, including Dart. Okay, default values must be compile time constants. So if you try to give it a default value of something that is not a compile time constant, like maybe a random number that it's not going to be able to know until the program runs, maybe you can't do stuff like that. No default value is provided. The default value is null. We've seen that. Okay. Setting default values for named parameters. Right. Okay, so they show us an example here where they're using bool without the question mark when they provide a default value. So I would follow that example until you figure out the nuances of having the question mark here with the default value. It may just be moot. Okay. Have we said enough about that? Maybe, yeah. Here's that deprecation note I just mentioned. Old code might use a colon instead of an equal sign to set default values of named parameters. Originally, only the colon was supported for named parameters. That support might be deprecated, so we recommend that you use equal sign to specify default values. Okay, so let's do something like, okay, those are optional. I kind of want to just get rid of those. Okay, so now let's include a named parameter. Is awesome. And let's give it a default value of true. And we're using the colon. Okay. Okay, again, what do I have over here? I have positional parameters. There's two of them, value and x. That's only used here. It's not a named parameter, so I can't say x equals 1 here. I just have to pass in the right position, the integer. But I can here say is awesome, and I can overwrite the default value. Okay, so now I want to just add is awesome. Hello. ToString. Okay. So now I'm expecting hello earth 1 false. There we go. Again, if I leave this off, this is a default value. It should say true now. Okay, hello earth 1 true. All right. But again, there's no deprecation. You can use a colon, but as they say, use an equal sign instead. Okay, cool. So everything ran just fine. Awesome. All right, we're at the last bit of this section. The next example shows how to set default values for positional parameters. Okay, I think we already did that, right? Yeah. Okay, so it's very similar. You have the type, you have the equal sign, and the value. There's nothing surprising there. So you can also pass lists or maps as default values. The following example defines a function doStuff that specifies a default list for the list parameter and a default mapped for the gifts parameter. Okay, let's just take this and play with it, shall we? Alright, so I'm going to replace what I have up here. Let's get rid of this text widget. And down here, instead of printing something, let's do stuff. Okay, so that is supposed to the first thing it has is a list of, so this is a compile time constant. This is a list here that's a compile time constant. It's a list of integers. Okay, so we're going to print lists. So we're going to have 1, 2, 3 interpolated there. And then a map of strings, string value, string key, string value. It's also specified as a compile time constant, and so this const is on the right side of the equal sign. Because that, when we run do stuff, we're able to do this. Okay, let's see what happens if I take away const. Okay, even before compiling, we get an analyzer error. The default value of an optional parameter must be constant. The default value of an optional parameter. Okay, we're saying that this is optional even though we're giving it a default value. Must be constant. Must be a constant, perhaps. Let's see what the analyzer docs say about it. The analyzer produces this diagnostic when an optional parameter, either named or positional, has a default value that isn't a compile time constant. Okay. Common fix. Okay, so this looks exactly the same as this. So maybe they're just, again, showing us what we're starting with, which is an optional parameter with a default value. Okay. If the default value needs to change over time, then apply the default value inside the function. Okay. So if it needs to change over time, instead of setting the default value as a parameter, you can define it, oh, look at that, in the function. So this says pass me an optional parameter. Pass me an optional argument to satisfy this optional parameter. I will use it and define it at a value, but if, okay, it's using this default value from outside here. Interesting. Okay, this is a little different than this example. Remember, if I wanted to say, hey, this is required, it doesn't matter. Now it doesn't like the fact that we have a default value with a required parameter. Because why would you require something if you have a default value, I guess. Okay, so we have const, like that. Probably get the same error for a map. Let's just see. Okay, same thing. I want to do one thing now. Let's take a look at this diagnostic message in depth. Oops. Let's take this and plug it in here. So we have a const, a default value, and now we're going to do, so our function is just the letter F now. It's not a good function name, just so you know. Never name your functions F unless you're just writing documentation or something. Okay, so when we invoke F, it's saying that, oops, right here, that it doesn't like it. It's going to give us an error. Is that correct? No, sorry. This right here is going to give us an error. Okay. So we have an analyzer error and we also have a compile time error. Okay, the invocation of default value is not allowed in a constant expression. Not a constant expression. I kind of want that other thing to come back. But the problem is this is not a constant, right? Remember, it said the thing on the right needs to be a compile time. Okay, we're kind of done with these. I'm just finishing out this last bit. I want to go over the default. Where is the, if I command F, it's going to find like everything on the page. Compile time constant. Come on, where is it? Default parameter values. Yeah, the default values must be compile time constants. Okay, so here's that text. Now, when we look at this, this is not a compile time constant. This is a variable. Okay, even if we had, does this work? No, because even the integer, how about that? Does that work? No, you can't do const like that. I would think this would be a compile time constant, but I guess it's not. If I did that, that would make a difference. Okay. Yeah, Dart's interesting. Okay, so just the variable default value 3. It's not a compile time constant, so it says the default value of an optional parameter. It's optional because we have this square brackets. Okay, the common fix, we're changing that to a const. Okay, so let's do that. Does that fix everything? It looks like it does. Okay, and nothing prints out because we don't have anything in our function body. Okay. Okay, so that's one way to do it. So no matter what kind of logic you're having in here, you can, on the outside, define the constant. Okay, that's only when the default value can be converted into a constant. So instead of using var, use const. The other way is if the default value needs to change over time. Okay, so again, we're going back to like, hey, sorry, I need this to be a var. It is saying move this assignment from here. So instead of having a default value in your parameter, you have it down here. Oops, what just happened? Okay, and they also use this thing called or equals, like so. Is that correct? I keep clicking on the documentation. Yeah. I'm going to copy and paste all of this actually. Make sure I didn't mess something up because I still see some problems. It doesn't look like anything changed, so what is going on here? Okay, let's say the parameter value can't have a value of null because of its type, but the implicit value is null. Okay, so yeah. So this is kind of like what's going on under the hood. If you don't specify the value here, it's kind of assigning null, which is not an integer. I think I know how to fix that by doing that. Okay, looks like everything went away, but I want to read this warning as well. The left operand can't be null, so the right operand is never executed on line 4. Okay, so here, the left operand can't be null. It has to be an integer, see? So the right operand is never executed. I don't quite understand that. Try removing the operand, the operator, and the right operand. How about that? Okay. I'm not as familiar with that. I think it kind of looks like in Ruby when you say or equals. I think that might be the same thing in Ruby, doing it like that. Okay, so maybe for null safety, this this diagnostic is incorrect. This actually needs to be a question mark for null safe Dart. Let's turn off null safety and see what happens. Okay, so that works like that. If we use this in non-null safe Dart now, this requires the non-nullable language feature to be enabled. That's all it does. Okay. Okay, so that is the difference there that I wanted to show you. So now when we call it as is, the default value can be 3 or 99. It doesn't matter because this can change at compile time, apparently, whatever this value is. But the value, whenever I run this, okay, it's setting the value. So now let's just print the value. Okay, so when I run F, I should see it printed in the console. Okay, so there's 99. That's my default value. It wasn't a default value in the parameters. We moved it down into this thing. Okay. So this line actually executed. It took 99, assigned it over here because value was allowed to be nil in the beginning, and then it printed 99. Okay, if I pass in an integer, let's do 77. Okay, so now 77 is coming in, and because that's not null, it's not even going to execute this. This is going to be ignored, and it should print 77. Okay, so that's what's going on there. If you take away this sort of optional assignment, or the nil assignment equal sign, I forget what they call that in Ruby. Let me find out real quick. Or equals, what do they call that? Okay. What is the word for it? Abbreviated assignments? That's a very cryptic non-answer. Okay. If it's undefined, then assign it. Otherwise, leave it alone. Yep, that's what I understand. But what's it called as an operator? What's the word so that we can have a language to refer to it? I don't know. This referred to it as something else. Abbreviated assignment or something. Is there a different? Or equals? Yeah, I think it's like or equals is what I would call that. Let's read somebody's article. There you go. Double pipe equals. I'm just scanning now. If the left-hand side of the comparison is true, or truthy in Ruby, if it has a value, not null, or not nil in Ruby actually, do the right side. Okay, I don't know if there's a name for it, but that's kind of what it does. Okay, so that does the same thing. Now, so what I want to show you is, if you don't have those two question marks in Dart, if I call F without a value, it's going to say, hey, this thing's null to begin with, and I'm definitely going to assign the default value. So let's go get 99 and assign it and print it. So I should get 99. If we call it with 77, however, it's still going to print 99, or whatever this is. Remember, this can be variable, so maybe it's 42. Now it's going to print 42 because even though I'm passing in 77, it's not blocking this assignment here. Okay, so it's going to get 42. The only way to block it is like, hey, if I pass something in, use that value. Don't use the default one. Okay, so that I think is it on function, parameters, arguments, optional, positional parameters, and also required or optional named parameters, and how to use that with null safety. Okay, so that's it. I'll catch you on the main function next time.